In the year 1977, a movie you just might have heard of called Star Wars came out and thoroughly shifted the kind of films Hollywood considered blockbusters. Up until that time, the idea of an epic sci-fi fantasy grossing hundreds of millions of dollars was considered laughable, and the genre was considered B-movie material at best. Star Wars changed that thinking, and suddenly studios were bending over backwards, flooding theaters with their own sci-fi epics. This led to Star Trek getting a crack at the big screen, with the original crew headlining a movie that, at the time, was one of the most expensive films ever made.
Oh my.
In this episode of Revisited, we dig into Star Trek, the motion picture. Flashback to 1978. Star Wars was still making a mint, and Universal made the bold move of taking the pilot episode for a Star Wars knockoff series they developed called Battlestar Galactica and releasing it into theaters. It made a stunning $41.8 million internationally, a huge number considering it was just a TV episode that had already aired. Universal pulled a double when a few months later they released the pilot of another Star Wars knockoff they made, Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, and it made $21 million, still a hefty sum. Clearly the appetite for science fiction was strong, and by 1979, theaters were flooded with Star Wars clones. There were brilliant ones like Ridley Scott's Alien, which subverted the formula, and then entertaining flicks like Disney's The Black Hole, and even the James Bond movie Moonraker, which takes a hard turn into sci-fi in the finale, sending 007 to space, and even including Star Wars-style laser battles in the finale. There were also dozens of Italian knockoffs like Star Crash and The Humanoid. Into the fray came Paramount Pictures, who must have thought they had the inside track as they owned perhaps the biggest sci-fi property of all, Star Trek. While the series had only run 3 seasons on TV, when it was sold into syndication, the show became a monster cult hit to the extent that the waters were tested when Paramount produced an animated series that played to surprising critical acclaim. Plans were made to produce another big-budget TV show called Phase 2, which was supposed to front a Paramount-branded TV network, which never came to fruition. The first season was set to run 13 episodes and would have included all of the original cast with the exception of Leonard Nimoy, who was in a legal battle with the studio over the use of his likeness in merchandise. He was replaced by a Vulcan character named Zahn to be played by David Gautreaux, while Persis Khambatta, a former Miss India, was hired to play Ilea, the ship's bald navigator. Then, of course, Star Wars came out, and Paramount opted to make Star Trek their next big franchise with the hope of outdoing Star Wars.
Movie, 2 words. Star Wars.
How do you do that?
They hired Robert Wise, the director of West Side Story, The Sound of Music, and The Andromeda Strain, to direct, with a budget that was supposed to be capped at $15 million, which would have been $5 million more than what Star Wars cost.
Great kid! Don't get cocky!
However, including all the money they spent on Phase 2, the final production budget of the movie wound up being about $44 million.
Is there anything else?
No.
The original cast had already signed on to Phase 2 and were easy sells on Star Trek as a feature, but Paramount studio chief Michael Eisner made the decision to dump Zahn, with the actor getting a bit part in the film instead, and enticing Leonard Nimoy back as Spock. To accomplish this, Eisner cut him a check for the back royalties Nimoy had been asking for, and said he essentially got on his knees and begged the actor to agree to play the part.
Excuse me, will you sit down, please? You're blocking our view.
Sorry, Mr. Eisner. Excuse me. It'll never happen again.
Persis Khambatta was kept on as Ilea, but she would get a new love interest, Will Decker, to be played by Stephen Collins, who was a rising star at the time. What's interesting about Star Trek the motion picture is how oblivious Paramount at the time was about what made a good Star Trek movie. Rather than give the crew any villains, the decision was made to go in a more heady, cerebral direction, with the Enterprise being called into action to investigate a mysterious alien crowd called V'ger. One could tell this was originally the premise of the Phase 2 pilot, and this would become a recurring thing as far as Star Trek pilots went, with the Next Generation and Deep Space Nine also having these obtuse, action-free pilots that fans, for the most part, dismissed years later.
Data, how can you be programmed as a virtual encyclopedia of human information without knowing a simple word like snoop?
What's especially egregious about Star Trek the motion picture is how underused the original cast is. James Doohan as Scotty, Nichelle Nichols as Uhura, Walter Koenig as Chekhov, and George Takei as Sulu all have very little more than bit parts, and even the holy trio, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, are sidelined, although DeForest Kelly gets some crazy facial hair and a medallion in his first sequence as McCoy. Whoa, he looks like he just wandered in from Studio 54.
Damn it, Bones. I need you.
Badly.
The focus of the film instead would be on the two young love interests, Decker and Ilea, and the romance. The original cast is given little to do but react to the effects on screen. As for those VFX, they would lead to the film going massively over budget as the original team contracted to deliver them were not able to deliver the effects that they needed in time. Veteran visual effects pioneer Douglas Trumbull, who had already done this kind of work for 2001: A Space Odyssey, was hired and given an unlimited budget, with the only caveat being that he only had months to deliver the effects as the studio had a contractually mandated release date in December of 1979. Eventually, John Dykstra, who was one of ILM's pioneers with Star Wars but had since gone out on his own, was subcontracted. They made the release date, but barely, as Robert Wise, the director, had no opportunity to test the film and fine-tune it, and he always considered it unfinished.
They can't expect us not to look them over now.
Now that we're looking down their throat.
Right, now that we got them just where they want us.
The film unexpectedly was a decent-sized hit, as many thought it would be a gigantic flop.
And take a look at this.
It grossed about $82 million domestically. This, of course, is a far cry from what Star Wars made, but it was still one of the top-grossing films of the year. Although considering the budget, it only actually earned a profit after the international box office lifted it to $139 million, which is pretty good money for 1979 dollars. It would be the only time in the franchise's history until the J.J. Abrams directed reboots where a Star Trek feature would be considered A-level, with all future films being handled by the TV wing at Paramount, with Harvey Bennett replacing series creator Gene Roddenberry as the franchise's creative steward going forward. Star Trek the Motion Picture earned mixed reviews from critics, with many fans disliking it, even going so far as to call it the motionless picture.
It stinks!
Watching it now, it has to be said that the movie is pretty dull, with only Jerry Goldsmith's incredible score really standing the test of time. His theme for the film would be reused as the Star Trek The Next Generation theme, and it's rightly considered a classic. Much of the dialogue in the film is very cheesy, with the script a patchwork of contributions by writer Harold Livingston, Alan Dean Foster, and Gene Roddenberry himself.
It would seem our friendship messages have been received and understood, Mr. Spock.
I would say that was a logical assumption, Captain.
The film always haunted Robert Wise for decades, and it wasn't helped by the myriad of editions that were floating around. One of them was a so-called extended edition, which ran on television and was released on home video. Wise hated this version of the movie, which ran only 12 minutes longer and featured unfinished amateur-level VFX. In 2001, Wise was finally able to complete the film when Paramount agreed to finance a definitive director's edition, which, among other things, allowed him to redo most of the special effects with CGI. He also remixed the soundtrack and made numerous substitutions and additions throughout the movie, removing bad takes that he thought featured some dodgy acting. And if you watch the deleted scenes on the DVD, it's pretty revelatory to see what little cuts could actually make the film come out a lot better. And he made it an altogether much more polished version of the movie, which largely won over the fans that had always found it underwhelming, including yours truly.
One of them is refusing to step into the transporter.
Oh, I'll see to it that he beams up.
It proved to be something of a last hurrah for Wise, who died a few years later, in 2005. However, the fact that the new CGI for the director's edition had only ever been done in standard definition proved to be a major headache as home media moved into HD, 4K, and beyond, with the director's edition unreleasable until a major restoration was done by Paramount Plus, who released it exclusively on their streaming service and later put it out on Blu-ray and 4K. As the movie exists now, it's considered something of a curio for fans, but is more of an aborted launch for the franchise than anything else, which would only really take off with the release of Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan in 1982. Persis Kambata and Stephen Collins' involvement with the franchise would be short-lived. Kambata's bald look in the film became a bit of a sensation when the movie came out, but when she grew her hair out, the thing is, she was unrecognizable, which might have hampered her career a bit. She'd go on to a well-received role in Sylvester Stallone's Nighthawks and would then appear in the action flop Megaforce. However, she would be faced with numerous health challenges, and the former Miss India would pass away in 1998 at only 49 years old. By contrast, Stephen Collins, for a while, had a very successful career, leading the cult TV show Tales of the Gold Monkey, and eventually moving on to the massive success on a family show called Seventh Heaven. Collins' career, which had been going pretty well up to that point, would end when, during a contentious divorce, a tape was leaked where the actor appeared to admit to the sexual abuse of a minor. He would eventually reveal to People magazine that he had actually abused 3 minors in 1973, 1982, and 1994.
How about new, you crazy Dutch bastard?
That would be the end of Stephen Collins.
You don't know what that'll do to you. Yes, I do, Doctor.
Happily, the main cast, while underserved in Star Trek The Motion Picture, were only at the beginning of their new silver screen adventures, with the series eventually launching Leonard Nimoy as one of the hottest directors of the 80s when his reluctance to continue to play Spock was parlayed into a deal to direct the third and fourth films.
Well, my work is done here.
What do you mean your work is done? You didn't do anything.
Didn't I?
This series would reach its creative peak with the Genesis trilogy, which would be comprised of the second, third, and fourth films in the series, which would continue on until eventually the Next Generation cast took over. While Star Trek The Motion Picture definitely is not a favorite among fans, it remains an interesting watch.
Out there. That-a-way.
When Paramount Pictures was preparing for a Star Trek sequel, the first thing they did was remove Gene Roddenberry, who had produced the first film and of course had created the show. They wanted to take the franchise in a different direction, so they hired TV veteran Harvey Bennett to come on and produce. The biggest priority for Paramount was to reduce the budget, and indeed, Bennett was hired because he told them he could have made 5 movies for what the first film cost.
I'm delighted. Any chance to go aboard the Enterprise.
While Star Trek The Motion Picture carried a price tag of $44 million, The Wrath of Khan would only end up costing $12 million. This is pretty impressive when you look at the movie and consider that not only does it feature some pretty epic space battles, but also contains early use of CGI.
Do you have any idea what you're saying? I was not attempting to evaluate its moral implications, Doctor.
Indeed, the smartest thing that they did was go to ILM, as George Lucas's company had proven expertise in delivering cutting-edge effects for a budget, and it was special effects, all of which were done in-house, that pushed the motion picture's budget into the stratosphere.
Sir, you did it.
I did nothing. Except get caught with my britches down.
Unlike the last film, The Wrath of Khan would focus on the original crew, with no additional juvenile leads, such as the first movie's Will and Ilia. The movie would really flesh out the Kirk character, with him forced to reckon with his own actions in the form of Ricardo Montalban's Khan.
Why are you here? And tell me where I may find James Kirk.
He's one of the best villains in the series, with him having starred in an emotional episode called Space Seed. In it, his Khan was a genetically modified Superman who, with his crew of superior humans, tried to hijack the Enterprise with the help of a crew member who had fallen in love with him. At the episode's end, Kirk, empathizing to some degree with Khan, maroons him and his crew on a new planet, which the grateful Superman takes as a challenge, as he'll finally be able to conquer his own world. He's even allowed to bring the crew woman who betrayed the Enterprise along as his wife. Here, in a surprisingly unseemly twist, we learn that Kirk never bothered to check on Khan and his crew, and that indeed an ecological disaster led to their world transforming into a hellish landscape that had driven Khan mad with a lust for vengeance, with the added twist being that many of his crew, including his beloved wife, died agonizing deaths due to the parasitic worm that Khan eventually was able to master into a way to make people do his bidding, as Chekhov and his unfortunate Captain Terrell discover to their absolute dismay.
These are pets, of course. Not white. Domesticated.
The script was by TV veteran Jack B. Sowards and Harvey Bennett himself, but the director they eventually chose to make the film, Nicholas Meyer, would overhaul the film without requesting pay or credit, by simply making note of all the things that people liked from the many previous drafts and combining them into one unified screenplay that was overhauled by himself. It would pay off for Meyer, who became a popular script doctor in the years to follow. Amazingly, Meyer had never seen a single episode of the show when he was chosen.
Who in the hell do they think they are?
Please be quiet. Commander Chekhov. This is completely irregular.
But he had written a book and a movie called The 7% Solution, which reinvented Sherlock Holmes for a more modern era, and had made a great sci-fi gem called Time After Time, which featured Malcolm McDowell as a time-traveling H.G. Wells who has to stop Jack the Ripper, who's run amok in modern-day America. While he may not have been a Star Trek expert, Meyer was a superb writer and director, and his idea for the film was to essentially make Horatio Hornblower in space. This is why the movie zeroes in on Kirk as a character in ways no other Trek film would tackle. Having reached middle age, Kirk considers himself over the hill and is consumed with regret. He knows he turned Khan into a monster, and his first battle with him leaves the Enterprise in ruins, with many of the young cadets staffing the ship dying these horrible deaths. Indeed, the mission would cost him dearly, with the most shocking part of the movie coming at the conclusion when his best friend Spock, once again played by Leonard Nimoy, sacrifices himself to save the Enterprise.
Of all the souls I have encountered in my travels, his was the most.
Kirk would also come face to face with the son that he abandoned, David, played by the late Merritt Buttrick, whose mother, Carol Marcus, was a former lover of Kirk's. Again, Kirk is very human in this, with him even having a family that he gave up in favor of his duty as captain of the Enterprise.
And also that I'm proud. Very proud to be your son.
While many mock William Shatner's occasional lapses into overacting, he gives a great performance here as Kirk.
What about my performance?
I'm not a drama critic.
In the motion picture, he was still trying to hold on to his youth, but here he's paunchier and basically, well, middle-aged. His flaws make him all the more human, and the Genesis trilogy, which comprises of this movie, Star Trek 3, and Star Trek 4, have a nice arc going for Kirk, as he really learns to move on past the limitations of middle age and basically recapture his mojo, which, of course, climaxes with him once again being named Captain of the Enterprise at the end of Star Trek 4.
It is the judgment of this council that you be reduced in rank to captain.
It could be argued that the flaws that Kirk shows in this movie make him a greater hero than he'd ever been before, and Shatner plays this aspect to the hilt. As for Leonard Nimoy, well, here's where it gets interesting. Many involved figured that The Wrath of Khan would be the last Star Trek movie. Nimoy, who had moved on from the character, was enticed back with the one thing that no other actor could really turn down, a great death scene.
I have been, and always shall be, your friend.
Yet, a few weeks into making the movie, all involved realized that, hey, they had a winner on their hands, to the point that Paramount significantly increased the budget of the movie from a proposed $8.5 million to $12 million. Even Nimoy was having fun as Spock, especially given how good the material was. So he asked for them to invent a device where perhaps his death wasn't as final as everyone assumed, which is why the insert of him doing the mind meld with McCoy was included, as well as the shot of his casket on the planet Genesis.
No. The world needs laughter.
Overall, Mayer made a great movie, with Ricardo Montalban delivering the greatest performance of his life as Khan. It's worth noting that at the time, he was probably the biggest star in the cast, headlining the then popular series Fantasy Island. Despite being in his 60s, Montalban had gotten very chiseled for the role, with many assuming he was wearing a chest piece, but he was always a very muscular guy and trained so hard that Mayer had the costumes redesigned to emphasize his new physique.
Please, you've got to give us time. The bridge is smashed, the computer's inoperative.
Time is a luxury you don't have, Admiral.
All the elements seem to come together spectacularly well in this, with James Horner breaking into the big leagues after delivering a sci-fi score that ranks as one of the classics of the 80s. Mayer also got lots of latitude from the MPAA with this, as at the time there was no PG-13, and PG movies in general could skirt with things that would nab them an R rating now. Raiders of the Lost Ark is a good example of this. So is a Chuck Norris movie called Lone Wolf McQuade, and, well, so is The Wrath of Khan, with some heavy-duty gore and violence, especially when Chekhov and Terrell get those worm creatures placed in their ears. Ugh. I remember showing this movie on VHS in elementary school, and the teacher forcing me to turn it off at our lunch program when the eel scene happened because all the kids were getting really upset. Well, all the losers were.
Why am I such a loser? Why?
Well, your father was a loser, and his father, and his father. It's genetic, man.
One of the movie's only issues is that Khan recognizes Chekhov despite the fact that, well, he wasn't part of the crew at the time that Space Seed was made. In the novelization, they just explain that he was stationed in another part of the ship. The late Paul Winfield also delivers a very sympathetic performance as the tortured Terrell, who has a heck of a death scene, with him agonizingly turning his own phaser on himself rather than killing Kirk, prompting Kirk's immortal Khan! In the end, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, would actually make less money than the motion picture, but given the difference in the budget, well, the profits for Paramount were out of this world. It made a whopping $78 million in North America, but like many of the Trek movies to follow, it wasn't as big of a hit internationally.
If they go in there, we'll lose them.
Explain it to them.
In the years that followed, really, North America would be the only place that a Trek movie could reliably make money. So if a Trek movie didn't do well in North America, then it was just going to end up being a flop. But this one, of course, was a massive hit, and the studio made even more money when, in a savvy move, they made the then novel choice to release the film as a sell-through tape for $39.99, which seems steep right now, but was considered a big bargain in 1983 as well. You could actually own a copy of Star Trek II on VHS, which was unheard of at the time. It became the highest-selling videotape ever until it was surpassed a couple years later. On TV, it would be shown in an extended edition, which, unlike the motion picture, would come to be known as the definitive version of the movie, with the most noteworthy addition being that a young crewman, Peter Preston, is actually shown to be Scotty's nephew, making his agonizing death scene all the more moving once it finally happens, and explains why Scotty is so upset. The film was such a smash that they immediately put a sequel into development, and indeed, a certain beloved crew member with pointy ears would make a triumphant return, but that's a story for another day.
I have been, and ever shall be, your friend.
Yes. Yes, Spock.
Star Trek II is generally considered the greatest Star Trek movie of all time, even more so than the J.J. Abrams films. In fact, Star Trek Into Darkness would kind of try to recapture some of the glory of the Wrath of Khan by bringing Khan back, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, and even doing a riff on the ending of Wrath of Khan. But here's the thing, it's not earned at this point. The legacy cast had, something like 20 years of film and TV behind them at this point. People loved the characters. Nobody had quite fallen in love with the characters yet when J.J. Abrams did it in his film. So, it doesn't have the same impact when you think that Kirk is going to die of radiation poisoning as it was when Spock died in Wrath of Khan. And of course, they brought Kirk back by the end of the film, where at least after the Wrath of Khan, we had to wait until one more movie. The only unfortunate side effect of Star Trek II and Star Trek IV and Star Trek VI being so good is that everybody always says that the odd-numbered Star Trek movies are terrible. And, well, it's just not true. I mean, Star Trek III, to me, is as good as 2 and 4. 5, maybe you got a point there. But, the whole only the even-numbered Trek things has always been kind of ridiculous. Also, Nemesis is even-numbered, and it's probably the worst Star Trek movie ever made.
Touché.
Shortly after Star Trek II came out, Leonard Nimoy was approached by Paramount Pictures about being in a potential third film, and he said yes, on the condition that he be allowed to direct.
Yes. Yes, Spock.
While this may seem like a somewhat outrageous request, Nimoy had actually directed plenty of TV by this point, including 2 episodes of William Shatner's T.J. Hooker, including a very well-received installment he also starred in called Vengeance is Mine, that featured him as a father hell-bent on murdering his daughter's rapist.
And if he does, you have yourself to thank for it. This is wrong, Paul. Dead wrong.
Everything you're doing is getting in my way, Hooker.
Everyone, including Shatner, was on board with Nimoy being behind the camera, except perhaps the one person who really mattered, studio head Michael Eisner, who believed Nimoy hated Star Trek and had demanded to be killed off.
Certainly, sir. How else can I keep my reputation as a miracle worker?
Nimoy had to convince him that this wasn't actually the case, and that he would be committed to the franchise going forward before getting the opportunity to direct. Perhaps conscious of the fact that the last film had only really been a smash in North America, the budget was still kept relatively low, with it costing $16 million compared to the last movie's $12 million.
How are we doing?
USS Enterprise.
Are we doing?
Respond, please.
Funny you should put it quite that way, Jim.
The effects were considerably better this time for a myriad of reasons, but the most important was that they were able to reuse sets and uniforms from the Wrath of Khan, allowing Industrial Light and Magic, ILM, to create some truly memorable sequences, such as the climactic explosion of the USS Enterprise.
My God, Bones. What have I done?
In the end, writer-producer Harvey Bennett was able to use a relatively simple device to bring Spock back. We learn that Spock transferred his essence, his Katra, over to McCoy. His body is still on the new planet Genesis, so Kirk, McCoy, Sulu, Scotty, and Chekhov, with an assist from Uhura, are forced to hijack the Enterprise to return to the now forbidden planet.
The word, sir? The word is no. I am therefore going anyway.
You can count on our help, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Sulu. I'll need it.
Meanwhile, Kirk's son David, once again played by Merritt Buttrick, along with the last film's breakout character Savick, who was recast after Kirstie Alley bailed with Robin Curtis, is sent along to the Genesis planet to discover a mysterious life form that actually turns out to be Spock. His body has been rejuvenated by the Genesis effect, but the planet is dangerously unstable due to David's shortcuts, and Spock's body ages from being a baby to adulthood in days.
What the hell is going on down there?
Meanwhile, a rogue Klingon commander, Krug, discovers the Genesis secret and wants it for the Klingon Empire. All 3 groups collide for a showdown on Genesis, one which will forever change the franchise's greatest hero, James T. Kirk.
You fool, look around you! The planet's destroying itself!
Yes, exhilarating, isn't it?
Now here's the thing, Star Trek III: The Search for Spock is the second installment of a loose trilogy made up of the second, third, and fourth films, with the sixth serving as kind of an epilogue. You could call it the Genesis trilogy, but I tend to view it as the Kirk saga. His arc in the films really gives the whole series one of its major thorough lines.
Sorry about your crew, but as we say on Earth, c'est la vie.
In Star Trek II, Kirk is in a midlife crisis, and indeed by the time the film ends, he's lost his best friend but gained a son. The third film would reverse that, as he's able to get his best friend back, but in the process loses his son. It changes the formerly kind and heroic Kirk into a much more cynical, bitter captain, something which only really pays off in the sixth film and is all but ignored by the fifth. He hates Klingons, he blames them for the death of his son, and when he learns that the entire race is on the verge of being killed off, his answer is simply, "Let them die." It's a dark side of the character that I don't think any other Star Trek series ever really explored. Thus, the third film is a very important one for William Shatner, as for the first time, Kirk loses, and loses big. Indeed, the movie ends with the destruction of the USS Enterprise, something which no doubt hit fans pretty hard in 1984. But the fact that Kirk's rescue of Spock comes at so high a cost makes this perhaps the most underrated, thrilling installment of the series. Nimoy, despite it only being his first go as a feature director, made a pretty good film. It's not as well crafted as the second, but he keeps the pace moving along nicely.
A solar eclipse. The cosmic ballet goes on.
Does anyone want to switch seats?
It's also the shortest film in the franchise, but only by a minute, and shows his flair for directing action. Indeed, the movie has one of Kirk's most memorable scenes, as at the end of the film he's trapped on Genesis with the movie's villain, Christopher Lloyd's Krug, and the two go head-to-head in a battle to the death. While people may mock Shatner's
I have had enough of you!
one-liner, as kids we used to say it over and over again because, well, we thought it was cool. One of the best things about Star Trek III is the cast. Shatner gets to do some of his best acting here, especially when he realizes that his son's been murdered. Watch him as he tries to hit the captain's chair but misses. DeForest Kelly gets his best Trek part to date, with McCoy on the verge of insanity for much of the film, as he simply can't handle Spock's katra.
Climb the steps, Jim. Climb the steps of Mount Saleya.
With Nimoy sidelined, McCoy becomes Kirk's number 2, and he seems to relish the bigger role. Scotty and Chekhov don't get a ton to do, but Sulu and Uhura both have nice moments. Sulu even uses a couple of judo moves on a hulking security guard who makes the mistake of calling him tiny.
Don't call me tiny.
While Uhura hijacks the transporters for a lovable crew.
This isn't reality. This is fantasy. You wanted Adventure House this.
Best of all is Christopher Lloyd as the villain, Krug.
Good. It's just a turn of luck I have been waiting for.
His casting must have been seen as pretty wild in 1984. He hadn't played Doc Brown in Back to the Future yet, and he was mostly known as the permanently stoned Reverend Jim on Taxi. He was so good in the part one wonders that maybe Robert Zemeckis and Steven Spielberg might have actually seen this when they were casting Doc in Back to the Future.
Oh, great Scott!
One thing that's also kind of interesting is that John LaRoquette, who everyone will remember as the iconic Dan Fielding on Night Court, plays Krug's second-in-command, Maltz.
Help us or die.
I do not deserve to live.
Fine, I'll kill you later.
When the movie was being shot, the show hadn't actually premiered on television yet, so he was still kind of a nobody, but by the time it came out, people actually knew who he was, so his role was kind of a treat. It's only a small role, but Maltz does come off as somewhat remorseful towards the end. My only issue is that because of all the other Klingons are dead at this point, why weren't Saavik, Scotty, Chekhov, and Sulu not able to take over the Klingon bird of prey once they beamed up? If the only one they actually had to deal with was Maltz. Does Kirk really have to do everything? The only place where the cast comes up short a little bit, in my opinion, is Robin Curtis. It's not that she's awful as Saavik, it's just that, well, Kirstie Alley was really iconic in the part, and one wishes that she had returned for the sequel.
I have no knowledge.
Then I hope pain is something you enjoy.
One person that did return, however, is James Horner, who once again composes a superb score, with Nimoy justifiably raving about it in the Search for Spock special features on the DVD Blu-ray. In the end, the film was politely received by critics, many of whom compared it unfavorably to The Wrath of Khan and said it was fine, but nothing more than that. One of the folks that really didn't care for it was President Ronald Reagan, who watched it at Camp David and wrote in his journals, "It wasn't too good." Whatever, Ronald.
Yeah. What do you know, skeet face?
As a fan, this movie holds a special place in my heart. Is it predictable? Sure, but only in the fact that because the movie is called The Search for Spock, you know they're not going to end it with them saying, "Sorry, we simply couldn't find him." As a Trekkie, This is probably my third or fourth favorite in the series, and audiences seem to agree with me, with it making only $2 million less than The Wrath of Khan did at the domestic box office, $76.5 million, despite heavy competition from Gremlins, Ghostbusters, and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom.
Okie dokie, Dr. Jones, hold on to your potatoes!
It was a big enough hit for Paramount that they actually opted to increase the budget by like $10 million for the next movie, which would become one of the few Trek movies to ever make a boatload of money overseas. But of course, that's a story for another time. So make sure to let us know in the comments below this video what you think of Star Trek 3. Is it, like I think, the movie that disproves the notion that only the even-numbered Trek films are good? Let us know.
I have been, and ever shall be, your friend.
Yes. Yes, Spock.
Now, Star Trek 2 and 3 were a lot of people's entry points to the Star Trek franchise. Since starting the series, we've had many people tell us via the YouTube comments that those two movies really made them fall in love with the series. For me, I must admit it was actually this, the fourth film, as it had heavy rotation on pay TV when I was a kid, particularly on the Canadian version of HBO called First Choice. And it was my introduction to the crew of the Enterprise, with me seeing 3 and then 2 soon after, meaning I watched the whole Genesis trilogy in reverse, although being about 6 years old at the time, I didn't even know what a trilogy was.
Got to bring in one at a time.
All I knew was Spock was alive in some of them, and then he died in one of them, and it made me really upset. Suffice to say, the Trek films thus far had been pretty big hits, but not quite blockbusters. Nevertheless, it had made the series popular again.
Consider ourselves lucky.
If Star Trek had been airing a lot on TV before the films came out, now it was virtually everywhere. And in 1986, the series would be celebrating its 20th anniversary. Paramount Pictures had already been plotting a new Star Trek TV series, but it wouldn't be ready to launch until the following year. But there was no way Paramount wasn't going to have a Star Trek movie in theaters to celebrate this milestone.
Let's do our job and get out of here. Our own world is waiting for us to save it, if we can.
While Paramount had gone into The Wrath of Khan with very little faith in the continued viability of the franchise, by the time 4 was kicking off, they were interested in taking it to the next level. They knew the interest was there, and definitely the movies were making a lot of money, especially in North America. Thus, the budget was increased significantly, from Star Trek 3's $16 million to $26 million for the Voyage Home, due partly to the fact that the cast commanded much heavier than usual salaries.
Does it mean exact change?
To make ends meet, they would need to make a very commercial movie, and Paramount had an ace up its sleeve, Eddie Murphy.
And where would a brave knight be without his noble steed?
All right, I hope you heard that. She called me a noble steed. She think I'm a steed.
At the time, Eddie Murphy was the biggest star on the Paramount lot, having starred in 48 Hours, Trading Places, and Beverly Hills Cop.
What kind of is this, man? Hold up, wait a second. You guys are arresting me for getting thrown out of a window? I got thrown out of a window, man!
Murphy, it turns out, was a huge Star Trek fan and wanted to be in one of the movies badly. Producer Harve Bennett and Leonard Nimoy had already decided to make this a lighter film without a villain, and taking a page from the classic episode, The City on the Edge of Forever, it would be a time travel story. The writer of Beverly Hills Cop, Daniel Petrie Jr., was brought in to write a script that could believably work as both a Star Trek movie and an Eddie Murphy movie. The choice was made to have the crew travel back to San Francisco in the 20th century. It was Nimoy's choice to give the film an ecological message, being inspired by the plight of the humpback whales who were being hunted to extinction by whalers. People may view this as a bit heavy-handed now, but I can tell you that every kid who saw this movie had nightmares about whales being slaughtered, and indeed, they were almost extinct at the time the movie was made, only numbering about 5,000 in the world. Now they're back up to about 135,000. Don't want to say that Leonard Nimoy literally saved the whales, but you know, he did not save the whales either. In the original script, Eddie Murphy was set to play a college professor who was obsessed with two things, aliens and humpback whales, leading to him helping the Enterprise crew in their quest, which is to bring back a humpback whale to the 23rd century in order to speak to a deadly probe that only communicates in whale song.
Holy macaroni!
In the end, cooler heads prevailed, and it occurred to everyone that bringing Murphy into Trek was kinda risky. Yes, it theoretically could greatly increase the Star Trek audience, but it would mean limited screen time for the crew, and probably even worse, limited screen time for Eddie Murphy. It wouldn't be a Star Trek movie, and it wouldn't really be an Eddie Murphy movie either. It'd be some kind of hybrid.
Well, then you're just gonna have to take your best shot. Best shot.
guess, Spock. Your best guess.
Guessing is not in my nature, Doctor.
Well, they probably still would have made a good movie because this was Murphy at his peak and, the Star Trek crew definitely knew what they were doing. There was also a chance that it could have been a little too much like Superman 3, where the movie eventually became a toned-down Richard Pryor type comedy.
I'm talking about drying it up like the machines that they have in the men's rooms. You know what I'm talking about? The hot air comes out and you put your hands under there and you dry them off. Sometimes they don't work, right?
There were probably better people involved with Star Trek 4, but hey, who knows? Murphy himself said,
I was going to be the one that they met when they got to San Francisco, and I was like, no, I want to beam up and, be on the ship, so I didn't do it.
And not, as he put it,
talking jive to Spock in San Francisco.
Murphy opted to make The Golden Child instead, which naturally was a smash hit, and he went on to make a bunch more huge movies all throughout the 80s, and even came back in the 90s, the 2000s, and hey, is still doing pretty well now. Murphy, for his part, has always maintained his love of Trek, with him joking about it in his stand-up, watching it in Boomerang, where he proudly tells Halle Berry's character that yes, he's a Trekkie.
I'm a Trekkie. That's why I broke it down to the barest essence of the Trek. I'm a Trekkie. I know everything about Star Trek.
They ended up turning to Nicholas Meyer, who had basically saved the franchise with Star Trek II, to retool the script with Harve Bennett, leading to the version that went into production. The proposed Eddie Murphy character was turned into a female marine biologist to be played by Catherine Hicks, who would serve as Kirk's love interest.
See you around the galaxy.
Meyer proved to be the ideal guy to write a time travel comedy, as after all, he had made Time After Time and mined a lot of laughs out of H.G. Wells' traveling to 20th century San Francisco.
You're not one of those guys from the military, are you? Trying to teach whales to retrieve torpedoes or some dipshit stuff like that?
No, ma'am, no dipshit.
Well, good. That's one thing I would have let you off right here.
Indeed, the movie unexpectedly turned into something of a laugh riot. No one ever thought a Star Trek movie could be legitimately funny, but the fish out of water aspect was done brilliantly, with Kirk and Spock traveling through San Francisco, learning to swear, assaulting annoying punk rockers, and basically having a good old time. Trivia, the punk rocker is actually played by the movie's associate producer Kirk Thatcher, who also wrote the song I Hate You with sound designer Mark Mangini.
It is currently laced with, shall I say, more colorful metaphors. Double dumbass on you, and so forth.
You mean the profanity?
Yes.
That's simply the way they talk here.
Everyone has fun with Walter Koenig's Chekhov getting into some hot water for infiltrating a nuclear base because, well, he's Russian and this is the Cold War after all. I guess nobody on the Enterprise knew a heck of a lot about history.
You son of a bitch!
The only issue the movie has really centers around the fact that Kirk and Spock are so prominent that everyone else is sidelined to some degree, although DeForest Kelly as McCoy gets a few good moments when he visits a quote-unquote barbaric 20th century hospital, even giving an old woman on dialysis a few pills that helps her grow a new set of kidneys.
Fully functional.
The resulting film would actually have a lot in common with the movie whose box office streak it actually broke, and it was another big hit for Paramount in 1986, Crocodile Dundee. Fish out of water was a formula that really worked for the studio.
He's got a knife.
That's not a knife. That's a knife.
One thing fans have noted about The Voyage Home is that the musical score is a major departure from what James Horner did in Star Trek 2 and 3. Apparently, Leonard Nimoy wanted him back, but at this point, Horner had become a top composer in his own right and opted to score movies like Aliens instead. Thus, Leonard Rosenman, who had a lot of sci-fi credits including Fantastic Voyage and a few of the Planet of the Apes sequels, was brought in.
Hey, come on, Potato Head. If Woody says it's all right, then, well, darn it, it's good enough for me. Woody has never steered us wrong before.
The movie was so well received that Rosenman actually earned an Academy Award nomination for his score. Indeed, the film was a resounding success at the box office, striking just the right chord with audiences, from its opening dedication to the crew of the USS Challenger, a disaster that had happened in January of that year, right up throughout the end credits. Fans liked it too, with it continuing the arc set up by the other two movies, centering around Spock's death and rebirth, while Kirk gets his groove back by shirking duty to save his friend and is punished by a demotion from admiral to captain, something he embraces wholeheartedly. The movie also sets up a plot thread that pays off pretty well in Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, where Kirk is now considered an enemy of the Klingon Empire, setting up a JFK-ish plot in the final film in the original cast franchise.
Back and to the left. Back and to the left. Back and to the left. Back and to the left.
Star Trek IV opened in theaters over Thanksgiving weekend in 1986, a shrewd move by the studio as it opened the saga up to a family audience. It grossed $109 million domestically. It was the first Star Trek movie to ever break $100 million at the domestic box office. It even did decent business overseas, and it was one of the first Star Trek movies ever to be shown in the Soviet Union.
Thought we were going to Russia, so I should write a song about Russia.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool that you called it USSR, you know, it's probably stopped being called that before you're born.
It was an even bigger hit on home video, where, notably, it was one of the first films released in the letterbox format when the studio eventually did a director's series. The home video launch also coincided with two more lucrative events for the Star Trek franchise. One, it hit stores just before Star Trek The Next Generation premiered, and wouldn't you know it, every home video contained an ad for the syndicated show. Paramount also started issuing the original series on VHS, which was unique, as not many TV shows had actually been released that way. It was a pioneering success.
My friends, we've come home.
Probably the one to benefit from the movie's crossover success the most was Leonard Nimoy, who all of a sudden was looked at as a legit director with a lot of talent as far as comedy went.
It's all lies, but they're entertaining lies. And in the end, isn't that the real truth? The answer is no.
His follow-up, 3 Men and a Baby, would be the biggest hit movie of 1987. Of course, William Shatner couldn't help but take note, and indeed, when Star Trek V, The Final Frontier came out, Shatner himself would trade the captain's chair for the director's chair. The resulting film was, well, not a hit, I'll say that much. But that's a story for another time.
All right, Mr. Sulu. Let's see what she's got.
Jump back to 1986, and Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home was a significant hit. It was the highest grossing movie in the franchise and earned critical raves. People that didn't even like Star Trek were down with this earthbound adventure of the crew of the USS Enterprise, and the franchise was riding a new, renewed wave of popularity.
Don't tell me. You're from outer space.
No, I'm from Iowa. I only work in outer space.
Oh, well, I was close.
On the small screen, Star Trek The Next Generation, after a rocky start, was starting to hit its stride, and the original series was reissued on VHS. People were loving the franchise, with it arguably at its peak of popularity around this point.
Please, Captain. Not in front of the Klingons.
While the obvious choice would have been to hook Leonard Nimoy and franchise vet Nicholas Meyer for more entries, Nimoy was suddenly red hot as a director. His follow-up to Star Trek IV, 3 Men and a Baby, was the highest grossing movie of 1987. Nimoy was down to return, but this time only as an actor.
Greetings, Captain.
Spock! What are you doing in this neck of the woods?
I have been monitoring your progress.
I'm flattered.
At any rate, William Shatner had been promised that he could direct the next film following a pay dispute over Star Trek IV. And like with Nimoy, him getting the gig actually wasn't all that outrageous, as he had directed plenty of TV. Shatner had a pretty strong pitch with him using the rise of television televangelists like Tammy Faye and Jim Bakker as inspiration.
Jesus loves us through anything.
Jesus loves me just the way I am. Jesus loves the way that I love.
While now this may seem a bit out of place in a Star Trek film, it was actually very topical for the late 80s. And indeed, the show itself had always fared best when tackling issues of the day, such as the Vietnam War and racism, albeit metaphorically.
What have you done to my friends?
I've done nothing. This is who they are. Didn't you know that?
No, I didn't.
Shatner had wanted Nicholas Meyer to help write the movie, but he was busy with his next film as a director, Company Business, starring Gene Hackman. Shatner and series producer Harvey Bennett worked out the story themselves, bringing on writer David Lowery to write the script. He had previously written Dreamscape, and in the 90s would become a popular writer of action movies such as Passenger 57 and Money Train. Lowery actually did a decent job with the writing, toning down some of Shatner's wilder ideas and bringing in Spock's brother, Sybok, as the evangelist character.
You made that up.
I did not.
You did too. Sybok couldn't possibly be your brother because I happen to know for a fact you don't have a brother.
Technically, you are correct. I do not have a brother.
Hey, you see? See?
I have a half-brother.
In the movie, Sybok hijacks the Enterprise with his followers in order to essentially find God, prompting the movie's best line of dialogue.
What does God need with a starship?
Sean Connery was courted to play Sybok, but in the end he opted to make Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade instead. Smart move, Sean. Rather, character actor Lawrence Luckinbull, who's actually the uncle of the Wachowskis, would take the part.
Your vision, given to me by God. He waits for us on the other side.
All this raised an issue, though. If you know your Star Trek lore, you'll know that Shatner, at times, was far from beloved by his supporting cast. When some of them realized Shatner would be the director, they bristled. For one thing, Leonard Nimoy and DeForest Kelly hated the script because it called for them to eventually side with Spock against Kirk, something they point-blank refused to play.
I cannot go with you. I guess you better count me out, too.
It was revised and they eventually signed on, but George Takei, played Sulu, didn't want to be directed by Shatner, who he'd always feuded with. Eventually he changed his mind, and to his complete shock, he actually found Shatner to be highly professional and collaborative as a director. In fact, everyone was impressed with Shatner's on-set skills, with Nimoy and DeForest Kelly, veterans of many television westerns, amused by the fact that they get to deliver a more physical performance this time. As the premise had the Enterprise in disrepair, meaning no transporter, thus they have to pull off a big rescue on horseback. This was Shatner's doing, as he'd always been a keen sportsman, and the film gives him ample opportunity to not only show off his skills on a horse, but also his talent at mountain climbing, with the opening of the movie featuring Kirk scaling El Capitan, although he's doubled extensively.
Perhaps because it is there is not sufficient reason for climbing the mountain.
I am hardly in a position to disagree. Hi, Bones! Mind if we drop in for dinner?
So if the shoot went well, what went wrong? Plenty. For one thing, there was no strong villain. Clearly, Star Trek IV's success weighed on everyone this time, so Shatner and his writers worked a lot of humor into the script, particularly in the first act, when the team is on shore leave.
What are we going to say? Bones, what are we going to say?
How about Camptown Races?
Pack up your troubles.
Are we leaving, Captain? It's a song title, Spock.
As kids, when Kirk, Spock, and McCoy started singing Row, Row, Row Your Boat, I pretty much checked out.
Merrily, 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 lightly down the stream.
To give Shatner his due, I think he wanted to give the supporting cast more to do, but some of the choices are bizarre, such as Scotty and Uhura kinda may be hooking up. Also, Sulu and Chekhov are acting like Laurel and Hardy when they're on shore leave and get lost.
We've been caught in a blizzard. And we can't see a thing. Request you direct us to the coordinates.
My visual says sunny skies and 70 degrees.
Sulu, look. The sun's come out. It's a miracle.
Some of the jokes are just awful, such as Scotty's pratfall where he claims to know the ship like the back of his hand before bonking his head on a pipe. It's slapstick level stuff. However, none of this is what actually torpedoes the film. It all comes down to the special effects, which Shatner himself said in his book Star Trek Movie Memories were decidedly less than special. Usually, ILM was able to pull off pretty incredible effects work, but they were busy doing Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade and Ghostbusters 2. Instead, Paramount had to go to a company called Associates and Farron, which sounds like a yacht rock band from the 70s, and the work they delivered was abysmal. Part of it was due to the movie's budget, which was about $33 million. This is significantly higher than the last movie. Mainly it was due to the fact that they only had 3 months to do the work, which is about half the time that they needed to complete convincing special effects. And the shortcuts they took are painfully obvious, with too much unconvincing rear projection used. They also had to scrap Shatner's action-packed climax. First, William Shatner was supposed to be chased by a Rockman in the finale, but the suit they had for the Rockman to wear was just ludicrous. Then he was supposed to be chased by a ball of energy, but the final effect was so bad it was scrapped. Now Kirk is just chased around by a villainous godhead that shoots puffs of light at him, all of which look just awful.
So it's me you want, you Klingon bastards. What are you waiting for?
For his part, Shatner's always bemoaned how poorly the climax turned out and has wanted to revise the ending, such as they did with Star Trek The Motion Picture. But Paramount has never approved the expense.
Oh!
I'm afraid I overshot the mark by one level. Nobody's perfect.
Is there anything good about Star Trek V: The Final Frontier? Well, it's short, that's one thing, running just over 100 minutes. It also has a good score by Jerry Goldsmith, who returns to the series for the first time since Star Trek The Motion Picture. But given how cheap everything ends up looking, some of Shatner's big directorial flourishes, such as Sybok's introduction, which is a homage to Lawrence of Arabia, feel painfully like a first-time director trying to show off. However, it should be said that Lawrence Luckenbull, as Sybok, is actually really good in the part, and Shatner directs himself well, delivering one of his loosest performances as Kirk.
Jim, try to be open about this.
About what? That I've made the wrong choices in my life? That I turned left when I should have turned right?
I know what my weaknesses are. I don't need Cyborg to take me on a tour of them.
In the end, the movie was a critical failure that, for some reason, seemed to take Star Trek Motion Pictures' lead as inspiration, even though that hadn't really worked 10 years earlier. It has no clear-cut villain. Cybok is very sympathetic. Sure, Star Trek IV didn't have a villain, but they had that amazing hook where they went back to contemporary San Francisco. In the end, Star Trek V flopped at the box office, only grossing $49 million domestically, a worrying number for the franchise. However, it should be noted that the film also came out during the infamous summer of 1989, which was jam-packed with blockbusters, including Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Batman, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, and Lethal Weapon 2. It was one of several sequels that underwhelmed at the box office, including the James Bond movie License to Kill and Ghostbusters 2.
I gotta sit down.
However, it did come very close to ending the big screen franchise, with series mastermind Harvey Bennett pitching a Starfleet Academy prequel starring a younger Kirk, Spock, and McCoy to the studio. Instead, Paramount, who knew the franchise would be celebrating its 25th anniversary in 1991, opted to bring the old guard back for one last hurrah, albeit with proven hands Nicholas Meyer and Leonard Nimoy at the helm. But that's a story for another time.
Merrily, 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 gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 gently down the stream.
Now, 1991 was a heck of a year to be a Star Trek fan. It was the 25th anniversary, and at only 10 years old, I remember it very well. They reissued all of the old films on videotapes in this cool collection where the spines, if you put them together, made out the Starship Enterprise, which, as kids, we all tried to do. Sadly, Gene Roddenberry, the creator of the series, would actually die just before Star Trek VI would come out, giving the 25th anniversary celebration a bit of a bittersweet feel. And to many, this movie ranks as one of the best entries in the series. Part of this may be due to the fact that after the Star Trek V debacle, the decision was made to allow Leonard Nimoy and franchise vet Nicholas Meyer the chance to spearhead the movie's development creatively. In the years since Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, Nimoy had become a hot director, with 3 Men and a Baby the biggest hit of 1987. However, since then he'd had a few flops, including the Diane Keaton, Liam Neeson drama The Good Mother, and the Gene Wilder comedy Funny About Love. Meyer also had a few flops, such as the Pierce Brosnan adventure movie The Deceivers and the Gene Hackman thriller Company Business, which barely got a theatrical release. Nimoy, who had just wrapped Funny About Love, wouldn't direct this one, allowing Meyer to return as director for the first time since Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Yet things would be different this time, with Nimoy having a lot more clout, having directed the most popular Star Trek movie of all time. Harvey Bennett was out, with the rumor being that the cast wasn't happy with his idea of making a Starfleet Academy movie, which was described by some as Top Gun in space, and would have only featured cameos for Shatner and Nimoy, with everyone else getting the shaft. Nimoy would essentially be his replacement.
I have personally vouched for you in this matter, Captain.
You have personally vouched?
One thing Nimoy always did well was that he knew, at its best, Star Trek functioned as an allegory. For the fourth film, he addressed the plight of the humpback whales directly, and the decision was made to broach the topic of glasnost with this film. At the time, the Cold War had finally ended, with the Berlin Wall having come down and relations thawing between Russia and the US.
Gorbachev, what are you doing here?
I just dropped by with present for warming of house. Instead, find you grappling with local off.
Oh, brought some of your commie friends to help you fight dirty, eh?
Star Trek VI, as written by Nicholas Meyer and his protege Denny Martin Flynn, would address the easing of tensions between the East and the West directly. The movie actually starts with a very thinly veiled version of Chernobyl happening, with the Klingon moon Praxis being destroyed after an accident, poisoning the Klingon homeworld. The former enemy of Starfleet now has to pursue peace, with Spock acting as an intermediary between Starfleet and the Klingon Empire. He is opposed by Captain Kirk, who harbors deep-seated prejudices against the Empire after the events of Star Trek III, where his son David Marcus was murdered by a rogue Klingon commander. As he tells Spock in one of the movie's most heated moments, "Let them die." Nevertheless, duty wins out over prejudice, with Spock volunteering the Enterprise to escort the Klingon Chancellor Gorkon, the movie's answer to Mikhail Gorbachev, to peace negotiations on Earth. Gorkon is murdered under Kirk's watch by 2 of his own crewmen, with him and McCoy, whose attempts to save Gorkon being misinterpreted by the Klingons, ending up imprisoned on an ice planet. Meanwhile, Spock and the rest of the crew try to solve the assassination conspiracy and clear Kirk's name.
Perhaps you know Russian epic of Cinderella. If shoe fits, wear it.
Mr. Chekhov.
I'd wager that of all the Star Trek movies, none has a better script than Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, as it serves as both an allegory while also functioning as an action-packed adventure. The whole crew is well served in this one. Shatner, who may have been smarting from the reaction to Star Trek V, delivers one of his best performances as Kirk. His prejudice and feelings as both a father and a Starfleet officer are given a lot of focus here, but rather than make you dislike Kirk, it makes him more human and relatable than he's ever been.
To be or not to be? That is the question which preoccupies our people, Captain Kirk. We need breathing room.
Earth, Hitler, 1938.
It's one of the most interesting takes on Kirk and Spock's relationship too, as it depicts the fact that despite being like brothers, they are two very different men, with Spock the diplomat who sees the big picture, while Kirk is blinded by his emotions.
You're a great one for logic. I'm a great one for rushing in where angels fear to tread. We're both extremists. Reality is probably somewhere in between.
Yet, the movie also allows Spock to be vulnerable, with him having a protege, Valeris, played by Kim Cattrall, who you may of course know from Sex and the City. Originally, this was supposed to be Saavik, but Kirstie Alley didn't want to return, and given that she turns out to be a traitor, all involved thought this might be too jarring. Spock's relationship with Valeris proves how he isn't above being blinded by his own feelings, and there's a great, if controversial, scene where Spock performs a mind meld on Valeris against her will, with it being the most morally compromised we've ever seen him. Meanwhile, DeForest Kelly, in his final go-round as Dr. McCoy, gets a lot of screen time, with him and Kirk stuck on the frozen planet Rurapente, where they meet Imans Marcia, a shape-shifting alien who betrays them.
What is it with you, anyway? Still think we're finished? More than ever.
Everyone gets a little something to do here, especially with Sulu being upgraded to Captain of the Excelsior.
Nice to see you in action one more time, Captain Kirk. Take care.
The supporting cast is one of the best ever assembled for a Star Trek film, with David Warner returning from Star Trek V, but as a different character, Chancellor Gorkon. Star Trek The Next Generation gets a shout-out with Michael Dorn playing an ancestor of Worf's, the Klingon attorney, who defends Kirk and McCoy. Brock Peters as Admiral Cartwright returns from Star Trek IV, and in a shocking move, he turns out to be the mastermind behind the assassination conspiracy. Best of all, though, is Christopher Plummer as the movie's one-eyed villain, General Chang, who has an eye patch bolted onto his skull.
In space, all warriors are cold warriors.
Plus, there's also a cool cameo from Christian Slater, which I vividly remember got a huge reaction in theaters when I saw it as a 9-year-old back in 1991.
Sir? You have hearing problems, mister.
No, sir.
It's all expertly directed by Mayer, who, despite working with a budget lower than the one they had for Star Trek V, peppers in some amazing set pieces, such as the show-stopping zero-gravity assassination of Gorkon, which George Clooney admitted in interviews he referenced in his Netflix movie, The Midnight Sky. While ILM's absence had been sorely reflected in the terrible FX work in Star Trek V, the company returned for this one and did top-shelf work despite a small budget.
It takes a lot of effort.
I don't doubt it.
In some ways, the lack of money paid off. In his memoirs, Mayer admits that he wanted James Horner to return and score Star Trek VI. The budget didn't allow for it, and after entertaining the notion of scoring the movie with Gustav Holst's orchestral suite The Planets, Mayer stumbled upon a demo tape from a young composer named Cliff Idleman, who wound up delivering one of the best scores in the series, which is saying a lot considering that, at least as far as the original cast movies go, the scores have always been really good. Unfortunately, Gene Roddenberry would not live to see the film's release, which came at Christmas of 1991, right in the midst of the 25th anniversary celebrations. Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country did much better at the box office than the fifth film, grossing $74 million domestically, which was pretty good considering it only cost about $30 million to make, and it almost broke $100 million worldwide, eking out about $99 million.
Is it possible that we two, you and I, have grown so old and so inflexible that we have outlived our usefulness?
This, no doubt, earned the studio a very nice profit, but it would turn out to be the swan song for the original crew, with only Shatner, and in much, much smaller roles, James Doohan and Walter Koenig, returning for Star Trek Generations. That movie would launch the Next Generation cast on the big screen, for a while anyway, but that's a story for another day.
They will continue the voyages we have begun, and journey to all the undiscovered countries, boldly going where no man, where no one has gone before.